Hello, 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 and welcome back to DLA Alternative. It's your boy Brandon, and I hope everyone is doing phenomenal as always. And thank you as always to everyone who keeps subscribing, liking, and following this journey with us. We are finally a family of over 1,000 subscribers, and we are on the road to 2K, people. That's the new goal, so keep helping us get there. But yes, as you can tell by the thumbnail and title, and from what you guys picked in the poll I posted, we are about to get into a big topic, all right? We are about to get into the Vecna / Henry / number one theory, and the reason it's titled that way is for a specific reason. So let's jump right into this one, and I hope you guys are ready. So what we're going to do with this one, if you did not check out the last theory, the sauna test theory, about how there's weird stuff going on with Will, okay? There's weird stuff going on with Will, basically, that I think he is connecting to something else other than just the Mind Flayer. And I don't want to say too much about that theory, all right? Go check that one out, but there's someone specific that I think he is connecting to, being Henry Creel and not Vecna, not number one. And yes, I say all those names separately, and that's why this theory is titled that way. So let's just jump right into this one. We're going to jump right in at the very end of this series, okay, so far. And this is going to be when we are in Vecna's lair during the piggyback episode, when he is holding up 11 and he is describing everything, okay? So jump right to that scene if you are watching as well. So before we start, I need you all to keep an open mind when you are watching this, that this is titled for a reason, Vecna / Henry / number one. Yes, 3 separate things, okay? And the biggest thing I have had trouble realizing and trying to connect in a proper way for you to all understand is basically the fact that it's hard to tell who is talking at certain times, all right? And yes, you might be extremely confused about that, but we're going to break down this scene, and I'm going to try and show you how this works, all right, and how this connects in a certain way. And it makes a lot of sense if I can explain this right, so just bear with me. So this scene is going to kick off, and it's right after we just saw Vecna and 11 fighting at the snowball, okay? Max's memory, so keep that in mind. And then all of a sudden, he pushes them back into this place, all right? And basically, he's putting Max up on that wall, all right? And he's about to do something. He's about to do what we see him do to Max, all right? With the whole mind thing and whatever happens to Max at the end of season 4. I kind of jumbled that, but whatever. But the major point is we see him about to do this, okay? And then all of a sudden, 11 says something. What does she say? She basically looks right over to him and she goes, "Papa is dead." And then what happens? He looks right over and that grabs his attention, okay? But there's a bigger tell here, people, and this is what I mean by you got to keep these names separate, all right? Because all of a sudden, 11 says something to him and she calls him Henry. And in my opinion, people, that makes a lot of sense why this kind of snapped him away from what he was just about to go and do. And then all of a sudden, he gets enough attention that he needs to go and walk over to 11 and describe exactly how all of this happened, supposedly. But basically, we see him walk over, okay? And this is the part where you got to keep in mind that this could be number one / Henry. And I'm not saying Vecna, okay? So just keep that in mind. Because during this part, he's talking about Papa specifically, how he was just a man, a mediocre man, all right? And basically, he gets to the major point here, people, that Papa was not the monster and that he was not the one that truly did this to him. And then he says that famous line, and all of a sudden, he tells 11 that you did this to me. So when we get to this part, all right, shut the Henry / number one off, all right, for a moment. Just shut that off in your brains for this whole entire scene until I tell you again. And there's a reason why, because I want you to think of this as the Mind Flayer talking to Elle here. When I say the Mind Flayer, I also mean Vecna. This is when Vecna comes in this scene, in my opinion. So just pay close attention and start seeing this like it's just the Mind Flayer here, because we see hints of this all the way back in season 2, people, when we see Will infected by the Mind Flayer. We see that he can act exactly like himself and convince people to do things and make people feel bad for him while he's in that hospital bed, right? But what you got to keep in mind is that when things get truly serious, and then when all of a sudden all of those demodogs come out and they're about to attack, what actually happens, people? Joyce looks at Will and says, "Who am I?" And she asks him over and over again, and he needs to analyze and scan her, and then he goes, your mom." And that's Joyce's tell that Will is not there. And that truly means, technically, that Will probably was never there this entire time and all throughout that scenario during season 2. But when we get to this level of this show, this season 4, and this very ending scenario, big moment of this show, okay, you have to keep in mind that this is the same thing that we saw happen to Will, people, except this is at an accelerated level, and we get an explanation here, okay? And I'm gonna try and explain this as best as I can, like I keep saying. But let's just keep going, people, and just keep in mind that this is the Mind Flayer talking and Vecna, not number 1 and not Henry. So just keep that in mind. I know it's extremely confusing, but basically this story starts off and it starts showing when 11 did that to Henry, and it says when 11 did that to Henry, he basically felt like you had sentenced me to my death, to purgatory specifically. And we see this scene like it's number 1 and Henry, okay, falling from the ground and falling into this dimension, and then all of a sudden it lands into this new world, okay? But as this conversation continues, the Mind Flayer / Vecna says to 11, well, I was wrong. It was somewhere new. And then it keeps going and it says, I became an explorer of a new realm, untouched by mankind. And this line right here, those words, untouched by mankind, in my opinion here, people, is a tell. Because if you think of it like this, people, that this is the Mind Flayer / Vecna talking right here, okay, we see that it says untouched by mankind. And that creature, specifically the Mind Flayer, is not a man or a woman, like we discussed in the last theory. This is a big shadowy dust cloud that overtakes the mind, the body, and whatever it wants in a human, okay? So as we're being shown this in this show, all right, it's showing us Henry number 1 walking through this new realm like an explorer, okay? And then all of a sudden, what we see in this story, okay, you got to keep in mind, these are two separate things. As the story continues, people, we hear the Mind Flayer / Vecna say that it discovered so many things, but one day it discovered something extraordinary. Specifically, people, the most extraordinary thing of all. And what this shows us, people, is that we see Henry / number 1 coming across the Mind Flayer. But like I said, if you keep this in your mindset that this is the Mind Flayer / Vecna talking, okay, the monster, all right? If you truly keep in mind that this is what is talking to 11 right now, this is the same type of thing, except look at it the opposite way. This could literally be the Mind Flayer / Vecna saying, when I discovered something extraordinary, being Henry / number 1. Not from the perspective, people, that we are being shown this scene, like we are seeing it from Henry Creel / number 1's perspective. If you look at this from the upside down perspective and like the Mind Flayer / Vecna talking, people, it seriously makes a lot of sense to this. And how we just heard that it discovered many things and that it became an explorer, right? We get this part of the story just after this, actually. Because as the story continues from the Mind Flayer / Vecna, all right, it starts saying that it discovered something that would change everything, okay? And what I want you to keep in mind, this is the only hint I'm giving you towards part 2 so far, is that if we do think of this like the Mind Flayer / Vecna discovering Henry / number 1, okay? If we truly think about it like this, when we see Nancy have her vision and when she is seeing this side of the story, okay, we're going to talk about that all in part 2, all right? But when we see her experience this, that is also kind of at the same time that 11 is finally figuring out this memory during the Nina project, okay? So we're kind of seeing two different things happening at the same time. But one of the biggest things that Henry number 1 says to 11 during that flashback memory that we somewhat see during that whole Nancy flashback, right, is what does he say to her, people? He says he wants to change the world, and he wants to change the world into what? Something beautiful. So just keep that in mind. But this next part, people, is also another tell, in my opinion, all right? Because it says, the Mind Flayer / Vecna says, all right? Basically, it says, within Henry, it found a means to realize its true potential and to transcend its human form. And this is the tell, people, okay? Transcend its human form. And like I said, if we look at this from Henry's perspective, it makes just logical sense. But if we think about this as the Mind Flayer's perspective, all right, this gets very interesting because we've seen this transcend so far. This whole entire time, people, throughout this whole show, at least from the point of season 2, we have seen the Mind Flayer Flayer transcend in a human form. We have seen it start off trying to go into will, and we saw it affect the mind, people. And then what do we see, people? We see it transcend, and we see it affect somebody who's a lot more dark-minded and a lot stronger in the body physically. And we know that as who? Our boy Billy, okay? So it transcends and it excels. It's getting stronger, and it's trying to figure this out, how to figure out what the bigger plan is. But the thing you got to keep in mind, people, is that when it does infect Billy, okay, what does that monster physically actually try to end up doing? It tries to take L's power. So just keep that in mind, that it finally discovered that while it was infecting Billy and transcending, that maybe Billy was not the true answer, okay, because it needed something stronger. It needed someone with L's power, all right? And then we get to now the connection to what is going on in this story, all right? How I just said that if this is the Mind Flayer saying it discovered something extraordinary, being Henry Creel / number one. If this is the case here, people, then this makes a lot of sense, because it did transcend its human form and it ended up getting what it wanted, people. So if we logically think about this with the timeline of events being the Mind Flayer, the timeline actually plays out, which is extremely interesting to this story now. That would mean that this timeline somehow started with this Demogorgon, if that Demogorgon might have been infected by the Mind Flayer, or maybe was it just the upside down infected by the Mind Flayer? That is a topic for another question, so we'll leave that for questions in the comments, okay? So leave your thoughts down there, as always. But anyways, let's continue, okay? But as we're talking about this Mind Flayer transcending its human form, okay, if we think about this logically, okay, Billy compared to Henry Creel / number one, the physical side of this transcending is a little different, okay? I don't really see this as it's transcending in a better physical form, if you ask me. From what we see from Billy, all right, we know Billy works out a lot. They talk about that in that season, okay? And we know Billy is just a physical and strong human being, all right? But he also is very dark and strong-minded. But the thing about Henry Creel / number one, all right, is that he's not really as physically strong as Billy. So in my opinion, people, is this why when we see this Mind Flayer take over Henry / number one, is this why we see Vecna the actual way he is, like this monster, like this big, strong type monster? Because logically, people, if you really think about this, it didn't really transcend, but in a way it did, because it transcended to a darker and stronger minded person, and also a person with these powers that you got to keep in mind, but not necessarily a more physical person. So is this why we see this monster the way we see it, as Henry / number one, but actually as Vecna? How everybody gets confused that we see Vecna, Henry number one. But if you really think about it, people, is Vecna just a shield over this Henry Creel / number one? Is this monster look that we see in Vecna only the physical form of this transcending, okay? Because logically, the mindset that this Mind Flayer monster is taking over is actually Henry Creel / number one. So maybe it needed a physical body that was stronger than his. And that gives us a real explanation of why we see this monster the way it does. And that also kind of gives it an explanation as that Vecna is only kind of like a shield to this physical body, which in my opinion, people, makes a lot of sense, that it's trying to keep that physical body and that mindset safe by putting a shield around it. And that also explains, people, that what we see at the very end of this episode, okay, in the very end of this series so far, is that we see Vecna get burnt to a crisp. So logically, people, I'm going to leave that for part two, okay? But what I want you to keep in mind, all right, is that we see that monster, that shield, get burnt to a crisp. So if we think about this logically, people, that Henry Creel / number one is still in there being shielded by this monster look. Whatever happened at the end of season 4, that could explain why we're getting behind the scenes footage that Henry Creel is with Holly Wheeler, like I talked about in the last theory. That gives it an explanation why we see him this way and not like Vecna yet. And yes, there are behind the scenes photos of Vecna as well. And I'm not going to show those, but to go down the rabbit hole through the internet and you might find them. But yes, there are behind the scenes footage of him like that as well. So you got to keep in mind that we see him two different ways in those behind the scenes footage. And I'm only showing this one because this one's been out there and put out there, okay? But as we continue this, people, these are the tells as well, okay? There's more tells throughout this if we analyze this in this way, okay? Because as the Mind Flayer / Vecna keeps talking, all right, it says, I found a means to realize my true potential, all right? And as this scene keeps going, all right, what do we start seeing all of a sudden, people? We start seeing the flashes of Henry Creel come in, okay? And there's a big reason for that, people, because all of a sudden it says to become the predator I was born to be. And again, if we think about this logically, like this is the Mind Flayer talking to us this whole entire time, and it's the one that discovered Henry Creel / number one in this random dimension, all right? All of a sudden, we see these flashes of Henry, okay, as this thing is talking. So this, in my opinion, people, is a major tell that this Mind Flayer monster has met Henry Creel once before. And the reason being is because we're starting to see these flashes. So this Mind Flayer monster, when it came across Henry Creel / number one in this dimension, if this monster has had any involvement with Henry Creel, like we see for Shadow origin story, people, but if for any reason in that play that this monster has any effect on Henry Creel as a child and when he is younger and they have had this contact before, this Mind Flayer monster should logically remember our boy Henry Creel, and maybe this is the point that it truly does. When it truly remembered, it could have been the predator it was born to be, people. Because this is the thing that I think might blow your minds, because I didn't ever look at it this way, and you have to look at all of these theories and stuff differently, like we're doing this whole entire theory. But if we think about this the opposite direction, all right, and we see this next scene, this iconic scene, people, this is the scene when we see Henry Creel start to reach out towards that shadowy dust cloud, okay? But as we hear this Mind Flayer / Vecna monster talking and telling Eleven this story, like I said, all of a sudden we start seeing these flashes of Henry as a boy, okay? And if this monster had contact with Henry as a boy, okay, and starts to remember, maybe this could be the major tell that this Mind Flayer monster started to remember that this is Henry because it started to remember what he was obsessed with as a boy. And we know what he was obsessed with, people. He was obsessed with spiders. So if we start looking at this iconic scene the opposite direction, all right, and we see this as Henry Creel all of a sudden reaching out, all right, if this Mind Flayer monster is trying to lure our boy Henry / number one in, okay, and we see this as the opposite, but if this Mind Flayer monster is trying to lure him in, wouldn't you think that this Mind Flayer monster would try and do something that this boy he used to know was completely obsessed with and maybe just magically form into something that this would snap this memory into our boy Henry / number one? This memory that they have had contact before, and it's showing itself like, oh, remember me, remember this, remember the visions you used to have as a boy, and remember the pictures you used to draw of me. And what do we see as this scene continues, people? We see that this is what Henry Creel was drawing, okay? But this is another hint towards part two, all right? In that Nancy flashback scene, when Nancy gets to this scenario, okay, it's slightly different, all right? But what we see Henry drawing in her flashback scene, all right, he is just drawing a spider. He's not drawing the Mind Flayer. So logically, if this Mind Flayer monster was out to get Henry Creel as a boy, okay, this Mind Flayer monster obviously wants to learn about Henry Creel, and maybe if it was partially in his mindset and connected to him, it would definitely learn that he's obsessed with spiders, people. So in this scenario, if we look at it different, maybe this Mind Flayer monster was turning into this to try and snap a memory back into Henry, and try and snap a memory back into Henry that once he pushed this away, but now he has the opportunity to have it back and do beautiful things, like he said, right? To change the world and reshape the world, people. But let me know your thoughts. I know this was a wild one, and I know this was an upside down one for sure, but this is a lot to take in, so let me know your thoughts, and any questions you have, just leave them down. We'll talk about them in part two. I was very confused at how to explain this properly, but I think I nailed it, so let me know. I'm going to try my best, and if I didn't, don't let me know, okay? Just like the video. Yeah, actually, that sounds like a better plan. Just like the video. I love each and every single one of you. You guys already know. Keep subscribing, liking, following this journey, and you guys already know. We out.